The introduction of the principle of elective representation to Nigeria in 1922 was initially targeted at male candidates and voters only. This discrimination added a layer to the existing indigenous patriarchy and formally laid the trend of marginalization of women in electoral politics and public decision-making institutions. Coming from the Greek and Roman ages, as well as in the few democracies that emerged in Europe by the end of the 18th century, women were excluded from voting. Women were not allowed to vote at all, not in any way. But when the franchise was widened, as it was in the United Kingdom in 1832, women continued to be denied all voting rights. The questions of women voting rights finally became an issue in the 19th century, and the struggle was particularly intense in Great Britain and the United States. But those countries were not the first to grant women the right to vote. No, they were not the first to grant women the right to vote, at least not on a national basis. By the early years of the 20th century, women had won the right to vote in national elections. Historically, the United Kingdom and the United States provided futuristic examples of the struggle for women's suffrage in the 19th and 20th century. And there is no way we would commence the origins of women's suffrage without reference to the United States and the United Kingdom. In Great Britain, women's suffrage was first advocated for by Mary Wollstonecraft in her book A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which she wrote in 1792 and was demanded by the Chartist movement of the 1840s. The demand for women's suffrage was increasingly taken up by prominent liberal intellectuals in England from the 1850s on. The succeeding years saw the defeat of every major suffrage bill brought before the Parliament. They were not taking it, they were not accepting it. This was chiefly because neither of the leading politicians of the day, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, cared to affront Queen Victoria's implacable opposition to women's movements. In 1869, however, Parliament did grant women taxpayers the right to vote in municipal elections, just the taxpayers. And in ensuing decades, women began eligible to sit on the county and city councils. The right to vote in parliamentary elections was still denied to women. However, despite the considerable support that existed in Parliament for legislation to that effect, in 1897, the various suffragist societies united into one union called the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society, thus bringing a greater degree of coherence and organization to the movement. These people came from their different divisions and joined together, making them stronger. No, they said, united we stand, divided we fall. So these women had to come together and become a strong union. But out of frustration at the lack of governmental actions, however, a segment of the women's suffrage movement became more militant under the leadership of Parkhurst and her daughter Christabel. Meanwhile, public support of women's suffrage movement grew in volume, and public demonstrations, exhibitions, and processions were organized in support of women's right to vote. When World War I began, the women organizations shifted their energies to aiding war efforts, and their effectiveness, they did much, yes, they did much, and because of that, they were able to garner attentions to themselves. The need for enfranchisement of women was finally recognized by most members of the Parliament from all the three major political parties that were existing, and the resulting Representation of People Act was passed by the House of Commons in June 1917 and by the House of Lords in February 1918. Under this act, all women aged 30 or above received the complete franchise, an act that enabled women to sit in the House of Commons and Shortly afterwards, in 1928, the voting rights were lowered to 21 to place women voters on an equal footing with male voters. Then coming over to United States, from the founding of the United States, women were almost universally excluded from voting. They were not allowed to vote, don't even get near to the poll. Only when women began to chafe at this restriction, however, was their exclusion made explicit. The movement for women's suffrage started in the early 19th century during the agitation against slavery. Yes, came at the same time as agitation of slavery. Women such as Maud and Elizabeth Handy Stanton showed a keen interest in the anti-slavery movement and proved to be admirable public speakers. These women were fighting against slavery and at the same time fighting for women's suffrage. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton joined the anti-slavery forces, she and Maud agreed that the rights of women, as well as those of slaves, needed redress. Subsequently, vigorous campaigns were conducted to persuade state legislatures to submit to their voters' amendments to state constitution, conferring full suffrage, not part, full suffrage to women in state affairs. Efforts were also made to give women the right to vote in presidential elections and, in some states, the right to vote in municipal and local elections. In the next 25 years, various individual states yielded to the movement's demand and enfranchised their women. Each such state increased the members of Congress elected partly by women. Those members were thus at least partly obliged by the nature of their constituency to vote for a women's suffrage amendment to the United States Constitution. By 1918, women had acquired equal suffrage with men in just 15 states. World War I and the major role played in it by women in various capacities broke down the most of the remaining opposition to women's suffrage in the United States. Amendment to the federal constitution concerning women's suffrage had been introduced into the Congress in 1878 and 1914, that's during the World War I. But the 1878 amendment had been overwhelmingly defeated, and the 1814 amendment had narrowly failed to gain even a single majority of the vote in the House of Representatives and Senate. By 1918, however, that's 4 years after, both major political parties were committed to women's suffrage, and the amendment was carried by the necessary two-thirds majority in both the House of Senate in January 1918 and June 1919, respectively. Vigorous campaigns were then waged to secure ratification of the amendment by two-thirds of the state legislatures. On August 26, the 19th Amendment was proclaimed by the Secretary of the State as being part of the Constitution of the United States. Women in the United States were formally enfranchised on an equal basis with men. It should be noted, however, that in practice, poor women and women of color continue to be denied of their rights in several states in the 20th century. Yes, women gained the right to vote, but not poor women and women of color. So there is still a long way to go if we should look at it. Sit back and stream on as we journey home to Nigeria on the suffrage movement for women's suffrage, the origin and the key actors who influenced the right of women to be involved in electoral decision-making processes. Here we are in Nigeria. Coming down home to Nigeria, the right to vote in Nigeria had a rather diversified history, met so many challenges. Universal adult suffrage became a reality in Nigeria in the 1979 elections when women in the North were allowed to vote for the very first time. They were able to participate in an election. Originally, the right to vote was taught as a direct consequence of property interest rather than adhering to the person as a political right. It was only gradually that the right to vote was altered from a property and income right to a political right. The history of voting rights in Nigeria mirrors to the complexity of the nation itself. Beginning with the country's colonial period, elections in Nigeria began in 1923 by the direction of the British colonial administrator Hugh Clifford, through a legislative act known as the Clifford Constitution. However, reflecting the variety of people, groups, and distinctive cultures confined with the nation's borders, the ethnolinguistic groups and colonial authorities that dominated the northern, eastern, and western regions of Nigeria often offered vastly different perspectives into suffrage qualification, notably including differences in gender, nationality, residency, age, tax, and income requirements in Nigeria's early years. Though the qualification that assured voting rights eventually became standardized under the Federal Constitution of Nigeria of 1960, just as quickly as voting rights were clarified. They were wholly revoked at the onset of several military coups beginning from 1966 and lasting up until 1999. Though women of southern and eastern regions of the nation gained their voting rights in 1958, women of the northern region, they couldn't say the same. Women of the northern region of Nigeria gained their right to vote in 1979. The suffrage movement was headed by several groups such as the Women's Movement of Nigeria and the Women's Wing of the Action Group, AG. Female suffrage was initially granted with regional specifications. In the Igbo-dominated eastern region and the Yoruba-dominated western region, women were allowed the right to vote in 1954. Though the election regulation of 1958 standardized the federal distribution of voting rights across the nation, women in the North remained unable to vote until the late 70s. Universal suffrage was achieved finally in 1979 when women in the North started voting. Nigeria was engaged and involved in broader West African debate about the role of women in electoral processes under pressure from parties such as the Women's Movement of Nigeria and the Women Wing of the Action Group. British government and Nigeria underwent a series of constitutional conferences in order to ascertain the method through which elections would be framed after the colonization period. The Lexington Constitution of 1954 afforded tax-paying southern Nigerian women the right to vote and to be elected. However, due to the fact that many women did not pay taxes, the female electoral base was extremely limited. It was as good as none of the women were voting because fewer women had properties and paid taxes. The women movement, notably including its president Elizabeth Adekobe, argued for universal suffrage, excluding the tax requirements in order to expand the number of women able to contribute to the electoral process by voting or running for office. Only after the military coup of 1966 to 1978 was true universal suffrage granted under the 1979 Constitution of Nigeria. Okay, let's take a closer gaze at women that fought for universal suffrage in Nigeria. Who was Elizabeth Adekobe? What was the women's movement of Nigeria? These and more we'll find out soon. and that shortly. Chief Elizabeth Adekowe, born 1919, was a Nigerian nationalist, politician, women's rights leader, and traditional aristocrat. She was the leader of the Ibadan-based women movement of Nigeria. In 1954, the movement changed its name to Nigerian Council of Women, which in 1959 merged with the Women's Improvement League to form the National Council of Women's Societies, a dominant pressure group and a leading women's coalition in Nigeria. Adekowe dedicated her life to creating opportunities for women in political spaces. One of the many things she fought for was the women's suffrage and the allocation of seats for women in the legislature. Unknown to many, women played an instrumental role in Nigerians' journey to independence. One of such women was Elizabeth Adekowe, a journalist, teacher, and women's rights activist, who was the founder and leader of the Women's Movement of Nigeria, an organization which was championed for the rights of women in political, social, and economic spaces. Adekowe worked hand in hand with Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, Borola, and the rest of them like Margaret Ebo. These pioneering women were staunch women rights activists and contributed to Nigeria's independence struggle. In December 1952, she and a group of 14 women founded the Women's Movement of Nigeria in Ibadan, of which she was its leader. The aim of the organization was to remove all political, economic, and social discrimination barriers against women, strengthen women's education, and to improve their living conditions, to promote the welfare of women in communities through cooperation between women's societies, and to train women to assume their responsibilities as citizens at both regional and national levels. In July 1953 in Abeokuta, Adekowe and collaboration with Ransome Kuti and Ebo founded the Federation of Women's Societies, a sector of the women movement. The main goal of this union was to prepare women to take up political offices. Adekowe would later leave the group over some disputes on her role. But then the movement did not stop, the still went on. In 1954, she became the organizer of the women's wing of the Western Regions Action Group Party. She also changed the name of the women movement to the Nigerian Council of Women. Adekowe was also a member of the International Council of Women, an organization founded in the United States to mobilize women of different countries. In March 1957, she, alongside Esan, the first woman member of the Nigerian Senate, and Ogulesi, another nationalist and women's rights activist, founded the Council of Women's Society, whose aim was to be an umbrella body to all women associations in Ibadan. Adekowe dedicated her life to creating opportunities for women in political spaces. One of the many things she fought for was the women's suffrage and the allocation of seats for women in the legislature. The 1951 Constitution also allowed women who were taxpayers of any form to start voting. Because there were only a few women taxpayers, the representation of women in political settings was low compared to men. In 1954, Adekowe wrote an article requesting total voting rights for women and more seats for women in the Western Region's House of Assembly. At the time, only women were appointed. Only one woman, was appointed to the legislature. Women participation in Nigerian politics is a topic of importance. Politically, women have been relegated to the background despite the tremendous effort put forward by government and non-governmental organizations following the declaration made at the 4th World Conference of Women in Belgium, which advocated 35% affirmative action and national gender policy recommendation of 35% affirmative action for a more inclusive representation of women both in elective and appointive positions. It is worthy to note that Nigerian women are still being marginalized due to the style of the leadership inherent in the country. Closing the gender disparities in the political space may also be achieved through relevant amendments to the Federal Character Commission of 1995 legislative intervention to review and amend the Act establishing the Federal Character Commission be expanded to include a gender component. Under such reform, a Federal Character, Gender and Equal Opportunity Commission can be established as a way to ensuring equal representation in all levels of democratic governance. Any of this representation offer windows of hope to increase women participation and representation in Nigerian politics.